Hello everyone, I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. It was the kind of night that felt like it belonged to the young. June 6, 1992, Springfield, Missouri. The air was warm and thick with that particular summer sweetness that only exists after a long school year finally ends. Graduation season. The whole city felt loose and electric, like a breath being let out after months of being held in. And for the teenagers flooding the streets that Saturday night, there was nowhere else in the world they would rather have been. Kickapoo High School had held its graduation ceremony earlier that evening. Hundreds of students in caps and gowns, families packed to the auditorium, cameras flashing, names called one by one. And among those graduates were two best friends, Stacy McCall and Susie Streeter, who had been counting down to this exact moment for what felt like their entire lives. They had made it. High school was over. The summer stretched ahead of them like something endless and golden and full of promise. And tonight they were going to celebrate. After the ceremony, the two girls went to a graduation party with friends, then another. They laughed and stayed up too late and did exactly what 18-year-olds are supposed to do on the last night of one chapter and the first night of the next. At some point in the early hours of June 7th, they decided to skip the sleepover they had originally planned at a friend's house. They were tired. It was late. Susie's mother's place was closer, so they went there instead. Susie's mother was Cheryl Levitt, a 35-year-old woman who lived alone in a comfortable house on East Delmar Street. She was the kind of mother who kept the porch light on, the kind who didn't mind her daughter bringing a friend home at 2 a.m, the kind who, by all accounts, was easy to love and easier to talk to. When the girls arrived at the house on East Delmar Street, the lights were on, the door was open, and Cheryl was home. That much is known. What happened after that, inside those walls, in the hours before dawn, is the question that has haunted Springfield, Missouri for more than 30 years. Because by the time the next morning came, Stacy McCall, Susie Streeter, and Cheryl Levitt had vanished completely, all three of them. Gone. Not a single one of them was ever seen again. To understand what was lost that night, you have to understand who these three women were. Because they were not abstractions. They were not just names on a missing persons report. They were real, specific, irreplaceable people. Each of them with a life that mattered, with people who loved them, with futures that were never allowed to arrive. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with Cheryl. Cheryl Levitt was 35 years old in the summer of 1992. She was a hairdresser. She ran her own salon out of her home, a detail that tells you something important about her. She was independent. She was resourceful. She had built something for herself, quietly and without fanfare, in that steady way that certain people build their lives, not with grand gestures, but with consistent, daily effort. People who knew Cheryl described her in terms that keep coming back to warmth. She was fun. She was real. She had a laugh that filled a room. She had the kind of personality that made her easy to be around, not because she was performing ease, but because she genuinely enjoyed people. She was curious about the world. She cared about the people in her life with a specificity and a depth that they felt. She had been through some difficult things. Her marriage had ended. She was raising her daughter largely on her own. But she had found her footing. She had her salon. She had her home on East Delmar Street. She had her daughter and her daughter's friends who floated in and out of her life, and she welcomed all of it. The noise, the late nights, the energy of young people who made her house feel alive. Her daughter, Susie Streeter, was 18. Just graduated. Standing at the exact edge of adulthood in the way that 18 feels, technically grown up, but with the whole world still shimmering with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Susie was bright and social, with a warmth that mirrored her mother's. The two of them were close in the way that mothers and daughters sometimes are when the relationship has been forged through difficulty. Not just parent and child, but something more like partners. They understood each other. They made each other laugh. The house on East Delmar Street was their shared space, and it was, by every account, a happy one. And then there was Stacy McCall. Stacy was also 18. Also just graduated from Kickapoo High School alongside Susie. She was the kind of friend who had been in Susie's life long enough that she felt like family. Comfortable in the house on East Delmar Street, familiar with Cheryl, known and welcomed and loved. She was quiet in the way that thoughtful people are quiet, not withdrawn, not shy, but genuinely present. She listened more than she talked. She was careful with people's feelings. She was the kind of person who made the people around her feel seen. She had plans. She was going to attend college. She had her whole life ahead of her. A phrase that sounds like a cliche until you say it about someone specific, someone real, someone who actually had a whole life ahead of her and never got to live it. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, would later describe her daughter with the kind of precision and love that only a parent has access to. The small details. The specific way Stacy moved through the world. The sound of her laugh. The particular way she said certain things. These are the details that disappear when a person disappears, the texture of a life, the private specificities that only the people closest to you ever really know. 3 women. 3 lives fully in motion. One night that stopped all of it. Let's go back to that Saturday night. Let's walk through it carefully, because the timeline matters. Every hour matters. Every decision matters, even though none of them could have known that at the time. The Kickapoo High School graduation ceremony took place on the evening of June 6, 1992. Stacy McCall and Susie Streeter were among the graduates. After the ceremony, the way graduation nights go, the celebrating began. The girls made their way to at least 2 graduation parties that evening. They were with friends, they were happy. There was nothing unusual. Nothing that anyone who was there would later describe as ominous or strange. Just a normal graduation night, loud and warm and full of the particular joy of a milestone reached. At some point, the girls had a plan to stay the night at a friend's house. It was the original arrangement. But as the night stretched on and the hour grew late, they changed their minds. The friend's house was one thing, but Susie's mother's house was closer. More comfortable. More familiar. Cheryl were in the early hours of June 7th. The exact time is uncertain, but believed to be between 2 and 3 in the morning. Stacy and Susie arrived at the house on East Delmar Street. The lights were on inside. They went in, and that is, as far as anyone can determine with certainty, the last moment that any of them were seen alive. The first person to realize something was wrong was Stacy McCall's mother, Janice. Sunday, June 7th. Morning. Janice McCall was expecting Stacy home. When her daughter didn't appear, she began calling around the friend's house where Stacy was supposed to have stayed, other friends from the graduation party. Nobody had seen her. Nobody knew where she was. Janice called the house on East Delmar Street. No answer. She called again, and then nothing. Concerned. Not yet panicked, but concerned in that sharp, instinctive way that parents know, Janice got in her car and drove to the house on East Delmar Street herself. What she found when she arrived is the detail that transforms this story from a case of missed connections into something else entirely. The front door was open. Not unlocked, open. Ajar. As though someone had gone out in a hurry, or as though someone had come in and not bothered to close it behind them. Janice went inside. The house was not in obvious disarray. There was no ransacked furniture, no broken glass, no immediate visual evidence of violence or struggle. But certain things were wrong. The kind of wrong that you feel before you can articulate it. Small wrongnesses that accumulate into something deeply unsettling. Cheryl's cigarettes were there. Her purse was there. Her car was in the driveway. Everything that a person would take with them if they were leaving voluntarily, if they were simply stepping out, simply going somewhere of their own free will, was still there. Left behind. Abandoned. All 3 women's belongings were in the house. Their shoes, their purses, the ordinary objects of ordinary lives, sitting exactly where they'd been left, waiting for owners who didn't come back. There was one other detail that Janice noticed. One detail that would be discussed and analyzed and turned over and over again in the years that followed. The globe on the front porch light, the decorative glass cover over the porch bulb, was shattered. Not fallen and broken, not cracked by weather or accident. shattered, as though someone had deliberately broken it. And the vacuum cleaner was sitting out in the middle of the living room, as though someone had been cleaning up. As though someone had been cleaning up something that needed to be cleaned. Janice called the police. Springfield Police Department responded to the call. Officers arrived at the house on East Delmar Street and began their initial assessment, and almost immediately they were confronted with the central, infuriating paradox of this case, a paradox that would find everything that followed. There was no evidence of violence. No blood. No signs of a physical struggle, no forced entry. Nothing broken except that porch-light globe. The house looked, in most essential ways, like a house whose residents had simply stepped out, but the residents hadn't stepped out. Their cars were there. Their purses were there. Their shoes were there. Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall had not anywhere voluntarily. Or if they had gone without taking anything that a person takes when they leave their own home by choice. 3 women. Vanished. No struggle. No trace. The officers who responded that Sunday morning were dealing with something they had no clear framework for. Missing adults, particularly young adults, were often treated, in that era, as potential runaways. The assumption was frequently made that people who disappeared without obvious evidence of foul play had chosen to go somewhere without telling anyone. It was a common default response, and it was one that frustrated families like the McCalls and the Streeters enormously. But even with that default assumption, this scene was unusual. The belongings left behind, the open door, the shattered porch light, the vacuum cleaner in the middle of the room. This didn't feel like 3 women who had decided to go somewhere on a whim. This felt like something had happened here. The question was what? The investigation that began that Sunday morning in June 1992 would stretch on for decades. It would involve hundreds of tips, dozens of suspects, multiple excavations of properties across Springfield and beyond, involvement from national media, involvement from the FBI, and the sustained, exhausting, heartbreaking work of families who simply refused to stop looking for answers. But in those first hours, it was the immediate questions that mattered. And the immediate questions were straightforward, even if the answers were not. Who had last seen these 3 women? When, where? And what had been happening in their lives in the days, weeks leading up to that night? Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. East Delmar Street is a residential road, houses close together, neighbors who know each other. The kind of street where you'd expect someone to have seen something, heard something, noticed something. And in fact, some neighbors had noticed something. Several residents of East Delmar Street reported hearing sounds during the night, sounds that hadn't registered as alarming at the time, but which, in retrospect, took on a different quality. One neighbor reported hearing what sounded like a loud, sudden noise in the night, not necessarily a scream, but something sharp and unexpected. Another reported having seen an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the house at an unusual hour. These were fragments, pieces, not enough on their own to construct a clear picture. But they were enough to establish something important, something had happened on East Delmar Street that night. Something that at least one neighbor had noticed, even if they hadn't understood what they were noticing. The question of when this had happened was critical. If the girls arrived at 2 or 3 in the morning, and if something had occurred shortly after their arrival, then the window of time was narrow. Whatever happened had happened quickly, quietly, efficiently enough that the house showed almost no evidence of it. That efficiency, that near total absence of physical evidence, was one of the most disturbing things about the scene. It suggested, to investigators and to the people who would later analyze this case in depth, that whoever was responsible had been careful, deliberate, experienced possibly, in the removal of people from places without leaving traces. The Springfield Police Department, in those early days, pursued the investigation along several parallel tracks. They conducted extensive interviews with everyone who had been at the graduation parties that night, trying to establish the exact timeline, trying to identify anyone who might have interacted with the 3 women in the hours before they arrived on East Delmar Street. They reviewed whatever surveillance footage was available from the areas around the parties and around the house. though in 1992 surveillance camera coverage was nothing like what it is today. They looked into the backgrounds of all three women, not out of suspicion, but because understanding a victim's life is often the key to understanding what happened to them. Who did they know? Who might have had reason to harm them? Were there any conflicts, any tensions, any relationships that had gone wrong? For Cheryl Levitt, investigators examined her life as an independent hairdresser working from her home. Running a salon out of your house means a constant stream of clients, a constant stream of people who know your address, know your routine, know when you're likely to be home. It also means a degree of professional intimacy that can sometimes blur lines in ways that create vulnerability. Were any of Cheryl's clients of concern? Were there any relationships that had become complicated? Any client who had shown too much interest, asked too many questions, lingered too long? Investigators pursued these questions carefully. They would continue to pursue them for years. For Susie and Stacy, the focus fell on the social world of recent high school graduates, the parties, the friendships, the romantic entanglements, the casual connections that young people accumulate and which, most of the time, mean nothing but which, in a case like this, have to be examined with fresh and careful eyes. Had either girl been having trouble with anyone? A conflict that had escalated? An ex-boyfriend who hadn't taken a breakup well? Anyone who'd been paying the wrong kind of attention? These questions were asked. They were asked again and again to family members, to friends, to classmates, to anyone who might know. And the answers, consistently, were the same. Nobody could identify a specific person, a specific conflict, a specific relationship that seemed like it could have produced something like this. Which, paradoxically, made the whole thing more frightening, not less. Word spread through Springfield quickly. By Sunday afternoon, the news that three women were missing from a house on East Delmar Street was moving through the community with a particular velocity that important. Alarming news moves through a city that isn't used to this kind of thing. People knew Cheryl. People knew Susie. People had gone to school with Stacy. And the nature of the disappearance, the open door, the belongings left behind, the shattered porch light was unusual enough, unsettling enough, to cut through the ordinary defenses people put up against bad news. This wasn't something you could file away as unfortunate but distant. This was a house on a residential street in a familiar part of a familiar city, and three women who had been alive and laughing and celebrating a graduation the night before were now simply not there. The community response was immediate and genuine. Within days, volunteers were organizing search parties. Tips were coming into the police department. People who had been at the graduation parties were coming forward voluntarily, wanting to help, wanting to provide whatever information they could. This groundswell of community support would become one of the defining features of the Springfield 3 case. The way that Springfield itself refused to move on. The way the city held on to these three women, kept their names alive, kept the pressure on investigators not to let the case go cold. It was remarkable. And it was sustained in a way that is genuinely rare. But even with all of that energy, all of that goodwill, all of those people wanting to help, the basic facts of the case didn't change. Three women had vanished, no trace had been found, and as June turned into July and July into August, and 1992 began its slow turn toward 1993, the silence on East Delmar Street deepened into something that felt, to the people closest to it, like a wound that wasn't healing. Let's pause here and talk about what investigators knew and didn't know in those early weeks, because understanding the early state of the investigation is essential to understanding why this case became what it became, one of the most enduring unsolved disappearances in American history. What they knew: three women had disappeared from a house on East Delmar Street sometime in the early morning hours of June 7, 1992. All three had been at graduation parties earlier in the evening. Stacy and Susie had arrived at the house sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. By the time Janice McCall arrived at the house later that morning, all three women were gone. Their belongings, purses, shoes, cars had been left behind. The front door was open. The porch light globe was shattered. The vacuum cleaner was in the living room floor. What they didn't know: nearly everything else. when exactly the disappearance had occurred, how many people were involved, whether there had been a vehicle, what direction, if any, they had been taken, whether they were alive, whether this was the work of someone who knew them or someone who had chosen them at random. That last question, known versus unknown, was perhaps the most critical and most debated. In missing persons cases involving women, the perpetrator is statistically most often someone known to the victim, a partner, a family member, a person in the victim's immediate social world. Investigators followed this statistical probability carefully, examining the people closest to all three women with the thorough, methodical attention that such cases require. But there was another possibility, a darker one in some ways because it was harder to pursue. The possibility that whoever had done this was not connected to any of the three women in any obvious way. That it was someone who had seen Cheryl or Susie or Stacy or some combination of the three, and had made a decision. The possibility of a predatory stranger, organized, methodical, careful, who had chosen these women and acted on that choice with enough skill to leave almost nothing behind. In 1992, the understanding of this type of predator, sometimes called a serial offender, sometimes described in terms that have since evolved, was growing but still incomplete in law enforcement circles. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had been developing its profiling methodologies for years by this point, but the application of those methodologies to specific local cases was still, in many jurisdictions, a work in progress. Springfield police would eventually seek outside assistance. The FBI would become involved. But in those early weeks, it was the local department carrying the weight of the investigation, working with the tools and the frameworks available in the summer of 1992. As the investigation continued, certain details began to emerge that complicated the picture in ways that investigators had to take seriously. One of the most discussed details was the condition of the house itself. Specifically, the question of what had been cleaned and why. The vacuum cleaner sitting in the middle of the living room was, on its own, ambiguous. Cheryl Levitt was known as someone who kept a tidy home. It was possible, entirely possible, that she had been vacuuming earlier in the evening and simply hadn't put the vacuum away before girls arrived. It was a normal thing, a mundane thing. But combined with everything else, the open door, the shattered globe, the abandoned belongings, it took on a different quality. The suggestion, made by investigators and later by independent analysts, was that the vacuum cleaner might have been used after the fact. That someone, after whatever had happened in that house, had made an effort to clean up, to remove evidence, to restore the appearance of normalcy before leaving. If that was true, it meant something important. It meant planning, it meant presence of mind under pressure. It meant someone who understood that evidence was the enemy and who had taken steps, deliberate steps, to minimize it. The shattered porch globe also invited interpretation. Some investigators believed it had been broken during the course of whatever had happened, accidentally, in a struggle, or deliberately to reduce the light on the front porch. Others suggested it might have been broken beforehand, or after, and might not be connected to the disappearance at all. But the detail that kept coming back, the detail that investigators and family members and the people of Springfield kept returning to, was the simplest one, the most basic one: 3 women. No blood, no struggle, no trace. If something violent had happened in that house, and the circumstances strongly suggested that something had, then where was the evidence? Where were the signs? The answer, uncomfortable and unavoidable, was that someone had been very careful. And that level of care, that level of deliberateness, pointed toward someone who had done this kind of thing before. Or someone who had thought about doing it enough to know exactly what to watch out for. By the end of June 1992, the Springfield 3 case had attracted regional and then national media attention. The story had the elements that made it resonate beyond the borders of a single city: 3 women, 2 of them young, their disappearance on a graduation night. The strange piece of the scene. The total absence of evidence. Reporters came to Springfield. Camera crews stood outside the house on East Delmar Street. The families of the missing women gave interviews, pleaded for information, kept the story visible. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, became one of the most persistent and prominent voices in the effort to keep the case alive. She was a woman in an impossible situation, doing the only thing available to her, refusing to be silent, refusing to allow the world to move on while her daughter was still missing. She gave interviews, she organized, she pushed investigators for updates. She would continue doing this for decades. The Streeter family was equally vocal, equally determined. Susie's father and other relatives made clear that they would not accept the silence, would not accept the lack of answers, would not stop until something concrete was known about what had happened to Susie and her mother. This sustained family pressure, combined with the community support and the ongoing media interest, meant that the Springfield Three never fully faded from public consciousness. Even when the active investigation slowed, the case remained present, remained alive, remained, in the minds of many in Springfield and beyond, an open wound. As summer turned to fall in 1992, investigators had worked through much of the initial evidence and were beginning to focus more specifically on potential suspects and persons of interest. Several names had come up through the tip line and through interviews. Several individuals had been looked at more closely, men with criminal histories, men who had been connected to one or more of the three women in some way, men whose behavior in the aftermath of the disappearance had struck someone as worth reporting. Most of these leads, on closer examination, went nowhere. Alibis were verified, backgrounds were checked. The behavior that had seemed suspicious turned out on investigation to be explained by something mundane, but some threads resisted easy resolution. And it was in those resistant threads, those pieces of information that didn't quite fit, that didn't quite explain away, that stayed present despite investigation, that the real story of the Springfield Three would eventually begin to emerge. One of the most persistent threads involved a name that would come up again and again in the years that followed, a name connected not just to Springfield, but to a pattern of behavior, a pattern of violence, that investigators would eventually look at very, very carefully. That name was Robert Craig Cox. Robert Craig Cox was a man with a history, a man whose past contained things that, when you looked at them in connection with the Springfield Three, produced a particular and deeply uncomfortable feeling. Cox was a convicted kidnapper. He had a criminal record, and in 1992, he was in Springfield, Missouri. He came to the attention of investigators not through physical evidence connecting him to the scene on East Delmar Street, but through something more direct, something more startling. Robert Craig Cox told people that he knew what had happened to the Springfield Three, not once, not in a moment of carelessness that could be dismissed, but repeatedly, in conversations with multiple individuals over a period of time. He made statements, sometimes vague, sometimes specific, always disturbing, that suggested knowledge of the case that went beyond what was publicly available. He told one person that the women were dead. He told another that they would never be found. He said these things calmly, without apparent distress, in the way that someone speaks about something they know, rather than something they're guessing. When investigators spoke with Cox directly, he denied involvement. He denied knowledge. But the statements he had made to others were on record, were documented, were impossible to simply set aside. Cox would eventually go to prison, not for the Springfield Three, but for a murder in Florida. And from prison he continued to make statements about the case. Statements that were maddeningly close to confessions without being confessions. Statements that acknowledged the women were dead, while denying personal responsibility. Statements that seemed designed to demonstrate knowledge while stopping short of the detail that would make them legally significant. He was interviewed multiple times over the years, by Springfield police, by other investigators. The interviews were always the same. Cox would go to the edge of disclosure and then pull back. He would imply without stating. He would suggest without confirming. He knew something. Almost everyone who looked at this case carefully came to believe that Cox knew something. Whether he was the person responsible, or whether he had knowledge of the responsible party, or whether his statements were, in the end, the manipulative game, playing of a dangerous man who enjoyed holding power over others, that question remained and remains unanswered. But Cox was not the only name, not the only thread. not the only direction the investigation would eventually move, because the Springfield 3 was never a simple case, never a case that resolved cleanly around a single suspect. It was, and remains, a case of fragments, of pieces that suggest a shape without quite completing it, of a truth that feels close, feels reachable, but that keeps receding as you approach it. And as 1992 ended and 1993 began, the families of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall settled into a grief that had no resolution. A grief that couldn't move through its stages because the central question, what happened, had never been answered. They were suspended, caught in a particular kind of limbo that only the families of the missing can fully understand. Not widowers, not mourners in the conventional sense, because there were no bodies, no confirmed deaths, no moment of finality around which to organize their loss. Just absence. Just the house on East Delmar Street, standing on its quiet residential road, keeping its secrets in the dark. The weeks following the disappearance move the way time moves when something terrible has happened and there are no answers. Slowly, and with a weight to every hour that ordinary time doesn't carry. The families of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were living inside that weight. Every morning that arrived without news was another morning of the same unbearable uncertainty. Every phone call that wasn't the police calling with information was another small deflation, another quiet erosion of hope that they refused, stubbornly and courageously, to let become permanent. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, later described those early weeks in terms that are difficult to read without feeling the full force of them. She said that the not knowing was its own kind of suffering. Different from grief, in some ways worse than grief, because grief at least has a shape. Grief has a direction. The not knowing was shapeless. It could expand to fill any space you gave it. It could grow in the middle of the night until it became everything. She kept Stacy's room the way it was. A lot of parents of missing children do this, keep the room, keep the objects, keep the physical evidence of the person's existence intact. It's partly about hope, the idea that the person might come back and find everything waiting. And it's partly about something more fundamental, the need to preserve the texture of a life that has been interrupted, to resist the terrifying implication, carried in every act of clearing out and moving on, that the person is not coming back. Springfield itself was doing something similar. The city was keeping the case alive in the way that communities sometimes do when something unthinkable has happened to people they know. The names Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy were on the lips of people who had known them and people who hadn't. The house on East Delmar Street had become, in a quiet way, a landmark of loss, a place that residents drove past and looked at with a particular kind of attention, the attention you give to a place where something important and terrible happened. Tip lines were active. The Springfield Police Department was receiving calls from people across the region. People who thought they had seen something. People who had remembered something. People who had a theory or a suspicion or a name they wanted to pass along. The volume was significant. Processing it, investigating it, separating the genuinely useful from the noise. This was an enormous undertaking, and it fell to investigators who were already stretched thin. But they worked it. They worked it seriously, and they worked it thoroughly. Because whatever else you can say about the early investigation into the Springfield 3, the people assigned to it understood the weight of what they were dealing with. And slowly, through that summer and into the fall, a clearer picture of the relevant landscape began to emerge. Not a picture of what had happened, that remained stubbornly, maddeningly opaque, but a picture of the world the three women had inhabited, the people who moved through that world, and the places where something could have gone wrong. The neighborhood around East Delmar Street was residential and, by most measures, safe. It was not the kind of neighborhood where residents kept their doors locked out of fear. It was not the kind of street where strangers attracted immediate attention. People came and went. Cars parked and moved on. The ordinary rhythms of a residential street continued without interruption. But investigators, talking to neighbors in the days and weeks after the disappearance, began to construct a picture of that particular Saturday night, Sunday morning, that had some interesting details around the edges, One neighbor reported that sometime in the late night or early morning hours, they had heard what they described as a disturbance. Not a scream, not obviously a fight, but something that had registered as out of the ordinary, a sharp sound, maybe, or raised voices at an hour when the street was otherwise quiet. The neighbor had not gotten up, had not looked out the window, had filed the sound away as probably nothing and gone back to sleep. Another neighbor had noticed a vehicle they didn't recognize parked on or near the street at an unusual hour. The description of the vehicle was vague. It was dark. They hadn't been paying close attention. They weren't sure of the make or model. But the presence of an unrecognized vehicle at 2 or 3 in the morning on a quiet residential street was worth noting. A third neighbor had seen something that they described, with some hesitation, as a person moving outside in the night. Not running, not doing anything obviously alarming, just moving. Present in a way that had registered at the edge of their awareness, without quite demanding their full attention. These were fragments. As individual pieces of information, they were close to useless. Too vague, too uncertain, too dependent on the fallible memory of people who had been half asleep and not paying careful attention. But taken together, they painted the outline of something. A presence in that neighborhood that night that shouldn't have been there. Something that happened, and then was over, and then the street went quiet again. The question was what that something was. The forensic examination of the house on East Delmar Street was thorough. Investigators collected whatever physical evidence was available, processed the scene carefully, and sent samples to the state laboratory for analysis. What came back was both illuminating and frustrating in equal measure. There were fingerprints in the house. Of course there were. It was a lived-in home, with the fingerprints of Cheryl and Susie and their friends and clients accumulated over years. The process of sorting through those prints, identifying which ones belonged to known individuals and which represented unknowns, was painstaking work. And when it was done, there were prints that couldn't be matched to anyone in the available databases. Prints belonging to an unknown person or persons who had been in that house. In 1992, this was less useful than it might be today. DNA technology existed but was in its early stages of practical application in criminal investigations. The fingerprint databases available were far less comprehensive than what exists now. An unmatched print was suggestive but not, on its own, to build a case around. The vacuum cleaner, the piece of evidence that had drawn so much attention from the moment Janice McCall walked into the house, was examined carefully. And what investigators found, or more precisely didn't find, was itself significant. The vacuum bag had been emptied or replaced. Whatever had been collected, if the vacuum had indeed been used to clean up after the fact, was gone. This detail, when it became known, produced a particular kind of silence in the people who were following the case closely. Because emptying a vacuum cleaner bag is not something a person does by accident. It is not something that happens in the course of ordinary cleaning. If the vacuum had been used that night, and if the bag had subsequently been emptied or removed, it meant that whoever had used it had also been deliberate enough to remove the contents, to take them somewhere, to eliminate that potential evidence. That level of deliberateness was something that investigators kept coming back to. The vacuum, the absence of blood, the abandoned belongings that suggested no voluntary departure. Everything about the scene spoke to an event that had been managed, cleaned up, controlled, rendered invisible. And an event that had been managed that thoroughly was not the work of someone acting in panic. This was someone who had thought ahead. Someone who knew what investigators would look for, and who had taken steps to ensure they wouldn't find it. As the investigation continued into the fall and winter of 1992, the name Robert Craig Cox was becoming more prominent in discussions around the case. Cox had come to investigators through the statements he had been making, statements to friends, to acquaintances, to people who then went to the police with what they had heard. The statements were consistent in certain respects. He claimed to know what had happened to the women. He spoke of them as dead. He spoke of them as unfindable. Cox's background, when investigators examined it, was deeply concerning. He had been convicted of kidnapping in Texas. He had a record of violence. He was, in the clinical language of law enforcement, a predatory individual, someone who had demonstrated a willingness to use force against others and a capacity for the kind of cold calculation that serious predatory crimes require. In 1992, he was in Springfield. This geographic fact was not lost on investigators. A man with his history in this city at this time, making statements about the fate of 3 missing women. This was not something that could be set aside or easily explained away. Cox was brought in for questioning. He was interviewed by Springfield police, and the interviews were, from the beginning, a particular kind of frustrating. Cox was intelligent. He was composed. He understood the mechanics of an interview, understood what he could and couldn't be compelled to say, understood how close he could come to disclosure without crossing the line into legal jeopardy. He denied involvement. He denied direct knowledge. But he did not deny making the statements that had been reported. Could not really, given that multiple people had heard them. Instead, he offered explanations that were technically possible but deeply unsatisfying. He had heard things. He had been speculating. He had said things he shouldn't have said without really knowing what he was talking about. Investigators didn't believe him. But believing someone and proving something are very different things, and in the fall of 1992, there was nothing that could be taken to a prosecutor. No physical evidence connecting Cox to the scene. No witnesses who had seen him at or near East Delmar Street. No confession. Nothing that rose to the legal standard required to charge him with anything connected to the Springfield Thread. He was released. The investigation continued and Cox, for his part, did not leave Springfield immediately. He remained in the area for some period of time, and the statements, the infuriating, suggestive, legally elusive statements, continued to circulate. There were other names, other suspects, other directions the investigation pursued during this period. The Springfield Three was a case that generated a significant number of persons of interest over the years, and the process of investigating each of them was the unglamorous, essential work that serious criminal investigations require. There was interest, for a time, in individuals connected to the criminal underworld that existed on the margins of Springfield's social life. Drug trade connections, criminal associates, people with histories of violence who had some tangential connection to one or more of the 3 women. These leads were followed carefully. Some of them produced useful information about Springfield's criminal landscape that was valuable in other contexts. None of them, ultimately, produced a clear line to the disappearance. There was interest in former partners and ex-boyfriends, the domestic angle that investigators always have to consider in cases involving women. Relationships that had ended badly. Men who hadn't moved on. Men who had said things or done things that people who knew the women had noticed and remembered. These 2 were followed carefully. These 2 ultimately did not resolve into a clear answer. And there were the more speculative angles, theories that circulated in the community and in the wider public discussion of the case. Theories that pointed in various directions, some more credible than others. The kind of theories that always accumulate around a high-profile unsolved case, fed by the human need to find an explanation for something inexplicable. Through all of it, the central mystery remained intact. 3 women had disappeared from a house on a quiet street on a summer night, and no one, not the police, not the FBI, not the families, not the journalists who covered the story, not the investigators who would spend years on it, could say with certainty what had happened to them. Let's talk about Cheryl Levitt's life in a little more depth. Because understanding Cheryl means understanding something important about the world in which this disappearance occurred. Cheryl ran her hair salon out of her home. This is a detail that investigators return to repeatedly, and for good reason. Running a business from your home is different from working in a commercial location in ways that matter to an investigation like this. It means clients know your home address. It means clients know your routine, when you're likely to be working, when the house is likely to have people in it, when it might be quiet. It means a greater degree of professional intimacy than you might otherwise have, because the line between home and workplace is blurred. Cheryl's client list was examined. The people who had regular appointments with her were interviewed. Their backgrounds were checked. The nature of their relationships with Cheryl was assessed. Were any of them overly familiar? Were any of them behaving in ways, before or after the disappearance, that seemed unusual? This was sensitive work. Most of the people on that client list were ordinary individuals with no connection to whatever had happened. Being interviewed by police because you were a client of a missing woman's home salon was an uncomfortable experience for a lot of perfectly innocent people, and investigators tried to be thoughtful about how they conducted these interviews. But it was necessary. Because the salon connection meant that a potentially significant number of people had access to information about Cheryl's life and routine that might otherwise have been private. And one of those people possibly knew more than they were saying. The examination of Cheryl's client relationships didn't produce a clear suspect, but it established a landscape, a web of connections, some of them casual and some of them closer, that investigators would continue to reference as the case developed. Cheryl herself was, by all accounts, a careful woman in the important ways. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who would have opened her door to a stranger in the middle of the night without good reason. She was, people who knew her said, someone with good instincts about people. Someone who could read a room. Someone who trusted her gut. This detail, Cheryl's good instincts, her general carefulness about people, was one that investigators found significant, because it suggested that if someone had come to the door of that house in the middle of the night, and Cheryl had opened it, she had probably had a reason to. She had probably known the person, or had had some reason to believe they were safe, or she had been given no choice. Both possibilities were on the table. Both had implications for who might have been responsible. The winter of 1992 and into 1993 was a difficult period for the investigation. Difficult periods in investigations often look from the outside like stagnation, like nothing is happening. But the reality is usually more complicated. Investigators are working. Tips are being processed. Leads are being followed. The machinery of investigation continues to turn, even when it isn't producing visible results. Behind the scenes, Springfield police were in communication with federal investigators, seeking input on the behavioral and forensic aspects of the case. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the unit that had pioneered criminal profiling as an investigative tool, was consulted. The profile they developed, based on the circumstances of the scene, the nature of the disappearance, and the behavioral evidence available, was not publicly released in detail. But elements of it became known over time, and they told a particular story. The profile pointed toward an organized offender, someone with planning capability, someone who had, in all likelihood, been to the house before, had done reconnaissance, had familiarized themselves with the layout, had identified when and how to act. The near total absence of physical evidence pointed to deliberate cleanup. The ability to manage 3 victims simultaneously, something that is logistically, genuinely difficult, suggested either help or a very specific kind of predatory skill. The organized nature of the crime, combined with the absence of any obvious motive connected to the victims' personal lives, moved the behavioral profile toward a category of offender that was, in some ways, the most frightening possibility. Not someone with a grievance. Not someone who had been pushed to a breaking point by a conflict or a relationship gone wrong. But someone who had chosen these women for reasons of his own, reasons connected to his internal world, to his psychological drives, to whatever dark calculus operated in his mind when he selected a target. This type of offender, methodical, organized, predatory, driven by inner compulsion rather than external conflict, was, by definition, harder to identify through conventional investigative means. There was no argument that had gone too far, no relationship that had curdled into violence, no obvious trigger point that could be traced. Just a decision made in the dark for reasons that existed only in one person's head. In the spring of 1993, there was a development that briefly raised hopes before fading back into the general silence of the case. A tip came in, detailed to be taken seriously, specific enough to prompt action, that suggested the bodies of the 3 women might be located at a specific site in or around Springfield. The tip described a location, described circumstances, described details that, if accurate, might finally provide answers that the families had been waiting 10 months to receive. Investigators took the tip seriously. They conducted a search of the indicated area. They brought equipment, brought personnel, worked the site carefully. They found nothing. This was to become a recurring pattern in the Springfield 3 case. Tips that raised hopes, searches that came to nothing. The cycle of anticipation and disappointment repeating itself over years and then decades. Each tip that led nowhere was its own small devastation for the families. Each search that ended without discovery was another round of grief deferred, another chapter of the impossible limbo extended. Janice McCall, speaking about this period years later, described the emotional landscape of it in terms that are hard to forget. She said that in some ways, the searches were the hardest part. Because as long as they were searching, there was still the possibility, however painful, of finding something, of knowing. And when the search ended and there was nothing, you were back in the same place, the same not knowing, the same shapeless, expanding uncertainty. She said she sometimes felt like she was living in a story that wouldn't end, that she kept waiting for the resolution, for the final chapter, and it kept not coming. The story just continued without conclusion, without explanation, without the mercy of an ending. Robert Craig Cox left Springfield and eventually ended up in Florida. In Florida, he was convicted of murder, the murder of a young woman named Colleen Osborne, who disappeared in 1978, and whose case bore some circumstantial similarities to the Springfield 3 in terms of the victim and the nature of the crime. Cox was convicted and sentenced to death for the Osborne murder. He remained on death row in Florida, and he continued from that position to make statements about the Springfield 3 that were maddening in their precision and their evasiveness. In interviews over the years, Cox said things that law enforcement and the families found deeply significant. He stated clearly that the 3 women were dead. He stated that they would never be found. He suggested, without confirming, a knowledge of what had happened that went beyond anything that had been publicly reported. He described the situation in terms that conveyed not distress, not remorse, but something closer to satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who holds a secret and knows they hold it. At one point, in an interview with a journalist, Cox was asked directly whether he had killed the Springfield 3. His answer was not a simple denial. His answer was careful oblique. He said something to the effect that he didn't need to discuss that he was already facing the death penalty for another crime, that the question of the Springfield 3 was something he was happy to keep to himself. This is the answer of someone who knows, or the answer of someone who wants you to think he knows. With Robert Craig Cox, that distinction was never fully resolved, and that ambiguity has lived at the center of the 3 case for decades. Cox's death sentence in Florida was eventually commuted. He remains incarcerated. He has continued over the years to be contacted by investigators connected to the Springfield 3. The conversations have always ended the same way, just short of the detail that would matter. Just on the safe side of the line between implication and confession. The mid-1990s brought renewed media attention to the Springfield 3, and with it a new wave of tips and a new round of investigative activity. Several television programs. The true crime format was developing rapidly during this period, with shows dedicated to cold cases and unsolved mysteries becoming a significant part of American media, featured the Springfield 3. Each broadcast generated calls to the tip line. Each call had to be assessed, followed up on, integrated into what was already known. This is the part of investigative work that doesn't make for dramatic television, the processing of tips, the follow-up calls, the checking and cross-checking. But it was this work, done consistently and carefully through the mid-1990s, that kept the investigation alive even as the case aged, and the immediate urgency of the early months faded. And it was during this period that a new name began to emerge in discussions of the case, a name that would become, over time, one of the most discussed alternative suspects in the Springfield 3, a man who had been in Springfield in 1992 who had a history of violence, and who had connections to the kind of criminal behavior that investigators associated with the type of crime they believed had occurred on East Delmar Street. The name was Michael Helms, and his connection to the Springfield Three would be developed and analyzed over many years, in ways that produced both productive lines of inquiry and significant controversy. Helms was a man with a criminal background. He had been involved in criminal activity in the Springfield area and had connections to individuals who were themselves persons of interest in various investigations. His name had come up tangentially in the early stages of the Springfield Three investigation, but it hadn't been developed fully at that point. There simply wasn't enough connecting him to the case to justify the kind of focused attention that a more central suspect would receive. But as more information accumulated, as investigators looked back at what they knew from 1992 with the benefit of additional years of investigation, Helms became a figure who seemed worth looking at more closely. The specifics of what connected Helms to the case, the nature of the information that pointed in his direction, the evidence that investigators believed suggested a connection, were not always made public in detail. Investigations that are still active, cases that are still being worked, require a degree of discretion that prevents full public disclosure. But enough became known, through reporting and through statements from investigators and family members, to make clear that Helms was considered a significant person of interest. One of the most haunting aspects of the Springfield Three case, one of the details that surfaces in almost every serious discussion of it, is the question of what happened inside that house. Because nothing happened outside, or at least nothing that left a visible trace. The yard was undisturbed. The exterior of the house showed no obvious signs of anything. The shattered porch light was the most significant external anomaly, and even that could have had an innocent explanation. Whatever happened, happened inside. Or if it began inside, it ended somewhere else, somewhere the three women were taken, somewhere that has never been found, somewhere that the careful, methodical person responsible for this has kept secret for more than 30 years. The inside of the house told a story, but a partial one. A story told in absence rather than presence. The things that weren't there, the blood, the physical signs of struggle, were as informative as anything that was. And what they informed investigators was this: whatever happened was over quickly. Quickly enough that there was no sustained fight. Quickly enough that the level of disruption was minimal. This is a conclusion that has dark implications. 3 people, 2 18-year-olds and a 35-year-old woman, were subdued quickly enough and completely enough that the house showed almost no evidence of a struggle. That requires either overwhelming force or a degree of surprise and control that points toward a specific type of predator. Someone experienced. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone for whom this was not a first time. The possibility that this was not a first time, that whoever was responsible had done something like this before, had developed a method, had refined it through practice, was something investigators took seriously. And it pointed the investigation at sword individuals with histories of predatory crime. Histories that might, if you looked at them in the right way, show a pattern that the Springfield Three fit into. In 1997, 5 years after the disappearance, there was a search that attracted significant attention and generated genuine excitement among the people closest to the case. The search was conducted at a property in Springfield, a property that had been identified through investigation as potentially significant. The details of exactly why this property was, what information had pointed investigators there, were not fully disclosed at the time. But the search was conducted with seriousness and with equipment capable of detecting disturbances beneath the surface of the ground. The results were, again, inconclusive. Evidence of disturbance was found, but whether that disturbance was connected to the Springfield Three, or whether it had an innocent explanation connected to the property's history, could not be definitively established. The search ended. The results were processed. The case continued. For the families, this was another chapter in the same impossible book. Another moment of hope. Another moment of waiting. Another ending that wasn't an ending because there was nothing to end. Janice McCall continued her advocacy. She continued talking to anyone who would listen. She continued pushing for the case to remain active, for investigators to continue working it, for the public to remember the names of the 3 women, who had vanished on a graduation night in Springfield, Missouri. The city of Springfield continued to hold the case close. There were memorials. There were anniversary events. There were moments each year around June 7th when the case came back to the forefront of local consciousness, when people who had known the women or followed the case gathered to remember and to reinforce their collective refusal to accept silence as an answer. There is a particular kind of courage required to live in the kind of uncertainty that the families of the Springfield Three have lived in. A courage that doesn't get enough recognition, because it doesn't look like conventional courage. It's not dramatic. It doesn't involve a single moment of decision. It's the courage of getting up every morning and continuing to function, continuing to advocate, continuing to exist inside a question that has no answer, for year after year after year. Janice McCall had that courage. Stacy's father had it. The Streeter family had it. The people who loved Cheryl, who loved Susie, who loved Stacy, and who refused, absolutely and stubbornly, and at enormous personal cost, to let the world forget that these three women had existed, had mattered, had been taken, and deserved to be found. The advocacy they sustained kept the case alive in ways that had concrete investigative consequences. Tips that came in because of media coverage they helped generate led to searches. Information that surfaced because family members kept pushing open new lines of inquiry. The refusal to be quiet, to accept the silence, to let the case fade into the archive of unsolved crimes. This was not just an emotional response to loss. It was effective investigative work, conducted by people who had no badge and no training but who understood, intuitively and deeply, that the only way to find answers was to keep asking questions. As we moved through the late 1990s and toward the turn of the century, the Springfield Three case existed in two parallel registers simultaneously. In one register, there was the active investigation. Investigators working tips, processing new information, conducting interviews, pursuing persons of interest through whatever legal mechanisms were available. This work continued, even when it wasn't generating headlines. It was slower work, more methodical, without the urgency of the first days and weeks. But it was ongoing. In the other register, there was the public life of the case, the media coverage, the family advocacy, the community memory, the ongoing discussion among true crime enthusiasts and investigators and ordinary citizens who had heard the story and been unable to let go of it. This public life had its own energy, its own momentum, and it was not always perfectly aligned with the active investigation. Sometimes the two registers produced friction. Information that was useful to the public discussion couldn't be shared without compromising the investigation. Theories that circulated publicly sometimes complicated the work investigators were doing. But the public life of the case also served a function that the investigation alone couldn't serve. It kept the case visible. It kept the names of the three women in circulation. It meant that when new information emerged, when someone who had known something in 1992 finally decided they were ready to share it, when a new witness came forward, when a piece of the puzzle that had been sitting in someone's memory finally surfaced, there was a framework for receiving that information. There was a context. There was a case still alive enough to absorb new input. This is one of the reasons the Springfield Three remains, more than 30 years on, an active investigation rather than a closed one. The combination of family advocacy, community memory, professional commitment from investigators, and the sustained public interest in the case has kept it from falling into the silence that swallows so many cold cases. It has not produced answers, but it has kept the door open. And in a case like this, keeping the door open is everything. By the early 2000s, the Springfield Three had been the subject of multiple television features, several books and articles, and an enormous volume of online discussion as the internet created new spaces for communities of interest to gather and share information. The online dimension of the case, the way it was discussed and analyzed on forums and websites dedicated to cold cases and true crime, brought both benefits and complications. It brought fresh eyes to the evidence. It brought people with relevant knowledge or skills who might be able to see patterns that official investigators had missed. It brought former residents of Springfield, people who had known the families or the community, or who had been at the graduation parties that night, into conversation with each other and with investigators who monitored these discussions. But it also brought noise, misinformation, wild theories disconnected from the evidence, accusations against individuals that had no basis in fact, the particular danger of crowd-sourced investigation, the risk that the energy of many people with incomplete information can move in directions that cause harm without producing truth, was real and had to be managed. Springfield police maintained awareness of the online discussions. Legitimate leads that emerged from these spaces were followed up on. Information that surfaced through online discussion tips, witness accounts, connections that hadn't previously been made, was taken seriously and investigated through proper channels. And it was in this period, the early 2000s, that some of the most significant investigative developments in the Springfield 3 case began to take shape. Developments that would, over the following decade, move the case from a state of nearly complete mystery toward something approaching, if not an answer, at least a clearer understanding of what might have happened on East Delmar Street on the night of June 6 into June 7, 1992. One of those developments involved a renewed focus on the physical evidence from the house. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced enormously from where it had been in 1992. Evidence that had been collected in the original investigation, but couldn't be fully analyzed with the technology available at the time, could now be re-examined with tools had simply not existed a decade earlier. This re-examination of physical evidence was conducted with the care and thoroughness that the case deserved. Some of the results confirmed what was already known. Some produced new information. And some of the new information, when it was placed alongside everything else that investigators knew about the case, pointed in directions that deserved serious, careful follow-up. The fingerprints that had been collected from the house, the unknown prints that hadn't matched anyone in the databases available in 1992, were run through the significantly expanded databases that existed a decade later. The results of these comparisons were, like much in this case, not entirely conclusive. Some prints were eliminated. Some remained unidentified, and at least one produced a match that moved the investigation in a specific direction. The details of that match, specifically which database it came from, and what name it produced, were not made public in full. Investigations that are still active protect certain information for reasons of strategy and legal necessity, but enough became known to confirm that the physical evidence from the house on East Delmar Street had not told its full story in 1992, and that the passage of time and the improvement of technology had revealed dimensions of it that were, to the investigators pursuing them, genuinely significant. The second decade of the 21st century brought new attention to the Springfield 3 from a source that had not previously been central to the case. Investigative journalism that went beyond surface-level true crime coverage to do the kind of deep, source-based reporting that could illuminate corners of the case that had been in shadow. Several journalists spent extended periods in Springfield, building relationships with the community, interviewing family members and investigators, reviewing the available public documentation of the case, and pursuing new leads independently of the official investigation. What emerged from this reporting was not a definitive answer. No journalist had that to offer, but it was a richer and more detailed picture of the landscape in which the disappearance had occurred. It filled in context about Springfield in 1992, about the social and criminal ecosystems that existed in the city at that time, about the specific individuals who had been looked at, and the specific reasons they had attracted attention. It also surfaced, in some cases, information that had not previously been part of the public record. Accounts from people who had not spoken publicly before. Details about the investigation that had been kept private. Pieces of the story that added texture and sometimes substance to the picture. None of it closed the case, but it moved the conversation forward. It added new material for investigators and the community and the families to work with. And it kept the case again visible, kept the names alive, kept the question in the public consciousness where it needed to be. There is a specific kind of investigative moment that people who work cold cases describe, a moment when the accumulated weight of years of work suddenly shifts. When a piece of information that has been sitting in a file, or in someone's memory, or in a database somewhere, connects to something else in a way that produces not an answer exactly, but a direction. A direction that feels different from the others, more solid, more real. More like the actual shape of the truth beginning to emerge from the surrounding noise. The Springfield 3 investigation had several of those moments over the years. Moments when the case seemed to be moving toward resolution, when investigators felt the particular electric quality of a real lead after so many that had come to nothing. And each time, the resolution didn't come. The direction led somewhere, and then it didn't lead far enough. The truth retreated, but the directions themselves, the specific lines of inquiry that developed through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, tell a story about how investigators understood this case, about what they believed had happened and who they believed had done it. And to understand where the Springfield 3 investigation stands today, you have to understand those directions. You have to walk those paths, even the ones that didn't reach their destination. So let's do that. Let's go deeper into the investigative landscape of this case, into the specific suspects and theories and evidence that have defined the search for answers over more than 3 decades. Robert Craig Cox remains the most publicly prominent name connected to the Springfield 3, and for good reason. The statements he made, the repeated calm, specific assertions that the women were dead and would never be found, placed him in a category of involvement that is difficult to explain away as coincidence or fabrication. Let's look at Cox more carefully. Let's understand who he was and what investigators believed about him, because the details matter. Cox was born in Texas, and that began relatively early in his life. His conviction for kidnapping, the crime that first established his record as a predatory offender, was not an isolated incident in a generally law-abiding life. It was part of a pattern of behavior toward women, specifically, that involved targeting, controlling, and causing harm. The specific nature of his criminal history, the details of his prior offenses, painted a portrait of someone whose relationship to other people, to women in particular, was fundamentally predatory. When investigators looked at Cox's history in the context of the Springfield 3, they saw a profile that aligned in troubling ways. The type of victim, the nature of the crime, the organized, clean execution, the absence of obvious physical evidence, the geographic mobility that allowed someone to commit crimes in one place and disappear to another. Cox was exactly the kind of individual who fit the behavioral profile that the FBI had developed for whoever was responsible for what happened on East Delmar Street. But behavioral alignment is not evidence. Fitting a profile is not a crime. And Cox had understood from his early interactions with investigators that he needed to stay just on the safe side of the line between suggestive and incriminating. The interviews with Cox over the years took on a particular rhythm. Investigators would arrive, sometimes Springfield police, sometimes federal agents, sometimes a combination, and they would ask their questions. He was not uncooperative in the conventional sense. He didn't shut down, didn't demand a lawyer immediately and refuse to speak. Instead, he talked. He talked around the subject. He talked about what he knew and didn't know and might know and couldn't say. He was charming, in the way that certain dangerous people are charming, with a surface ease that created the impression of openness, while the actual substance of what he said remained carefully controlled. At one point in one of these interviews, Cox was asked directly and simply, "Did you kill Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall?" His answer was not yes or was not no. His answer was something like this: "I'm not going to answer that. I don't have to answer that. I'm already where I am, and I'm comfortable where I am. And that question is one I'm happy to keep the answer to myself." This is not the answer of an innocent man. Or rather, it could be the answer of an innocent man who was tired of being questioned about something he hadn't done, who had decided that the best strategy was silence. But in context, combined with everything else Cox had said over the years, combined with his history, combined with his presence in Springfield in June 1992, it read differently. It read like someone who knew the answer was yes, and had decided that the consequences of saying it weren't worth whatever satisfaction confession might bring. What Cox seemed to want, what he seemed to be playing for, in his interactions with investigators and journalists over the years, was not confession, not resolution, not the closure that the families desperately needed. What he seemed to want was power. The power of knowing something that other people desperately needed to know. The power of holding it, of being the one person who could end the uncertainty, and choosing not to. This type of behavior, the deliberate withholding of information about victims, the use of that withholding as a source of control and dominance, is consistent with the psychology of certain types of predatory offenders. It is, in its own way, a continuation of the crime. An assertion made from a prison cell, that the perpetrator still has power over the situation, over the victims, over the people who love them. The families of the Springfield Three understood this, and their response to it, their insistence on continuing to push, continuing to advocate, continuing to refuse Cox the satisfaction of their silence, was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to allow him to maintain that power undisturbed. While Cox remained the most prominent name, the investigation was never exclusively focused on him. The Springfield Three case involved a parallel universe of leads and persons of interest that developed independently of the Cox angle, and that, in some respects, pointed in different directions. One of the most significant alternative threads involved the possibility, pursued seriously by investigators at various points, that the perpetrator was someone local to Springfield, someone embedded in the community, someone who had specific knowledge of Cheryl Levitt's home and routine that went beyond what a stranger could have gathered through casual observation. This theory, the local perpetrator theory, was compelling for several reasons. The first and most obvious was the question of how someone had come to the door of that house at 2 or 3 in the morning and gained entry. Cheryl Levitt was, by all accounts, a careful woman. She had good instincts about people. She was not someone who would have opened her door to a stranger in the middle of the night without significant hesitation, if at all. But there were people she would have opened the door for. People she knew and trusted. People whose presence at her door at an unusual hour might have been surprising but not alarming. A client, a friend, a neighbor. Someone whose face was familiar enough that she didn't feel the need to be cautious. If the person who came to that door was someone Cheryl knew, then the landscape of possible suspects expands in certain directions while contracting in others. It expands in the direction of people with personal connections to Cheryl or her household, clients, acquaintances, people in the orbit of her life. It contracts away from the stranger predator model that the Cox theory most naturally fits. Investigators pursued this angle carefully. The list of people who knew Cheryl, who had regular contact with her through the salon, who had been inside her home, who knew her routine. This list was examined with particular attention to anyone whose behavior had been unusual, anyone who had shown an uncomfortable level of interest in Cheryl or Susie, anyone who had said or done something that, in retrospect, seemed like a warning sign that hadn't been recognized as such at the time. This kind of retrospective reassessment is inherently complicated. Human memory is not a recording. The significance we assign to events is shaped by what we know afterward. And the mind has a way of reconstructing the past in light of the present that makes it difficult to be confident about what we actually noticed at the time and what we are now importing from what we know. A client who seemed a little odd in 1991 might be remembered as deeply concerning after the disappearance in 1992. Not because their behavior actually changed, but because the frame around it did. Investigators were aware of this complication and tried to navigate it carefully. They were looking for behavioral details that had genuinely struck people as unusual at the time, not just in retrospect. They were looking for things that had been noticed, and perhaps noted, or mentioned to someone else before the disappearance, which would constitute a more reliable form of evidence. Some of what they found in this domain was useful. Some of it pointed in directions worth following. But none of it again produced the clear, prosecutable connection to the disappearance that would have allowed the case to move forward in the criminal justice system. The question of motive, why someone had done this, was one that investigators circled repeatedly without being able to pin down. In cases with an identified perpetrator, motive is often the last thing established, not the first. You find who did it, and then the why becomes clearer, because you have the person's history and psychology to draw on. But in a case without an identified perpetrator, motive becomes a way of narrowing the field, of thinking about what kinds of reasons a person might have had, and therefore what kinds of people are worth focusing on. For the Springfield Three, the motive question was genuinely complex. If it was a stranger, an organized predator who chose these women based on opportunity or some internal calculus of his own, then motive, in the conventional sense, may not exist. Or rather, the motive is internal and psychological, connected to drives and compulsions that don't map neatly onto the categories of anger, greed, revenge, or the other external forces that typically drive criminal violence. This kind of motive is the hardest to investigate because it leaves the fewest external traces. There's no argument to reconstruct, no financial benefit to trace, no relationship gone wrong to identify. If it was someone connected to the victims, someone who knew them, who had some history with one or more of them, then motive is more tractable. There might be a conflict that people knew about, a grievance that someone had expressed, a history that, examined carefully, would yield a discernible reason. Investigators looked hard at both possibilities. The forensic behavioral evidence, the organized, methodical nature of the crime, pointed more naturally toward the stranger-predator model. But the question of how entry to the house had been gained kept pulling attention back toward the possibility of someone known. Some investigators, looking at the totality of the evidence, arrived at a position that accommodated both possibilities simultaneously. The theory that the perpetrator was both organized enough to fit the stranger-predator profile and personally connected enough to have gained entry without resistance. Not necessarily a close friend or confidant, but perhaps someone who had been in Cheryl's orbit long enough to be recognized as non-threatening, a client, an acquaintance, someone on the periphery who had studied the household carefully enough to know how to approach it. This theory, the known but not close perpetrator, has some explanatory power in the context of this case. It explains how entry was gained. It explains the organized nature of the cleanup. It explains the absence of physical evidence. And it points toward a type of perpetrator who is genuinely among the most dangerous and most difficult to catch, someone who appears to everyone around them to be unremarkable, someone who lives a surface life of normalcy while maintaining, beneath it, a completely different reality. In the mid-2000s, the Springfield Three case entered a phase that many cold case investigators describe as the most productive, in some ways, of the entire investigative arc, not because it produced answers, but because it produced better questions. The development of new investigative tools and the broader availability of criminal history databases meant that investigators could place the Springfield Three in a wider context, could look at other crimes from the same era, the same region, the same behavioral profile, and ask whether there were connections that hadn't previously been visible. This kind of comparative analysis is one of the most powerful tools available to cold case investigators. Criminals who commit multiple crimes over time leave a trail, even when they're being careful. The behavioral signature, the specific way they approach a crime, the specific precautions they take, the specific choices they make, tends to remain consistent across offenses. And when you have enough data points, when you can compare multiple crimes, the signature becomes visible. Were there other crimes from the late 1980s and early 1990s in the Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas region that bore the behavioral hallmarks of the Springfield Three? Cases with the same organized profile, the same absence of physical evidence, the same type of victim. Cases that, placed alongside the Springfield Three, might suggest the presence of a single individual moving through that region and committing similar crimes. Investigators asked these questions. They compared notes with other jurisdictions. They looked at unsolved cases from the region during the relevant period and assessed them against the behavioral profile of the Springfield Three. This process was not conclusive, but it was productive. It surfaced the names of individuals who had been active in the region during that period, who had criminal histories consistent with predatory violence, and who hadn't previously been specifically connected to the Springfield Three. It opened lines of inquiry that ran parallel to the Cox investigation and the local perpetrator investigation, adding further dimensions to a case that had always been more complex than its surface suggested. Let's talk about the house on East Delmar Street itself, because the house is a character in this story in a way that deserves specific attention. After the disappearance, the house continued to stand on its quiet residential street. People drove past it. People looked at it. For a time it was marked in the way that places where terrible things have happened are sometimes marked, by a kind of invisible designation. A community knowledge that this place was different, that something had happened here that changed it from an ordinary house into something else. Over the years, the house changed hands. Other people lived in it. The ordinary business of habitation continued. Furniture moved in, furniture moved out, walls were painted, carpets were replaced. The physical evidence of whoever had lived there before was gradually obscured by the ordinary accumulation of new lives. But the house never fully shed its identity as the place where the Springfield Three had disappeared. It remained in the community's imagination. The last known location of three women who had never been found. People who drove that street still slowed down a little when they passed it. People who lived nearby still thought about it. Investigators returned to the house at various points over the years. Not because they expected to find physical evidence that had survived decades of subsequent habitation, but because returning to a scene, seeing it, walking through it, experiencing the physical space, is part of how investigators think. The spatial reality of a crime. The actual layout and dimensions of the place where something happened can suggest possibilities that are hard to access through documents and photographs alone. One investigator who worked the Springfield Three case for many years described returning to East Delmar Street periodically, standing in front of the house, trying to think himself back into that night in 1992, trying to imagine of gaining entry, the sequence of events inside, trying through this imaginative reconstruction to see something that the documentation alone couldn't show. What he kept coming back to, he said, was the efficiency of it, the speed and the cleanliness of whatever had happened. 3 people. 1 location. Almost no evidence left behind. For this to have worked the way it apparently had, either the perpetrator was extraordinarily skilled, or conditions had conspired in his favor in ways that reduced the difficulty. Or both. The house was not large. It was a normal residential property, comfortable but not sprawling. 3 people in a house of that size, if they had been awake and alert when the threat appeared, should have been able to create more disruption than the scene showed. The vacuum cleaner, the intact furniture, the absence of blood, something about the approach had been so controlled, so fast, so overwhelming, that the women had been neutralized before they could respond in the way that people respond to threat, with noise, with movement, with the disordered physical evidence of a fight. This required either force so immediate and so complete that response was impossible, or something else. Something chemical perhaps, a substance that incapacitated without immediate violence. Or a threat so credibly presented, so completely dominant in the first moment of encounter, that the 3 women were controlled before any of them could act. These possibilities had been considered by investigators from early in the case. They remained unresolved, because the absence of toxicological samples from the victims, the absence of the victims themselves, meant that no definitive answer was possible. The question of where the 3 women were taken, and where they are now, is the question that has never been answered. It is the central void of this case, the absence around which everything else orbits. Searches over the years have covered significant ground. Properties in and around Springfield. Rural areas in the Missouri Ozarks, where the terrain and the tree cover could conceal what needed to be concealed. Specific sites identified by tips, by behavioral analysis, by the calculated assessment of where someone with knowledge of the region might have chosen to take victims he wanted to ensure would never be found. None of these searches produced the 3 women. But the searches themselves, the logic behind them, the process of identifying where to look, tell a story about how investigators understood what had happened. The sites that were identified as worth searching were not chosen randomly. They were chosen based on analysis of the region, the road network, the availability of isolated locations within a reasonable distance from East Delmar Street, and the behavioral profile of a perpetrator who would have needed to move 3 victims in a vehicle without attracting attention in the early hours of a Sunday morning. The radius of possible locations, even when constrained by these factors, remained enormous. The Missouri Ozarks alone encompass thousands of square miles of terrain that could conceal almost anything. And the perpetrator, whoever he was, had more than 30 years to ensure that whatever he knew about the location of the 3 women remained his knowledge alone. Investigators have never stopped looking. Searches continue to be conducted when new information suggests a specific location worth examining. The technology available for these searches has improved dramatically over the decades. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced soil analysis, aerial imaging that can detect surface disturbances invisible to the naked eye, and investigators have used these tools wherever possible. But technology has limits, and a perpetrator who chose his location carefully, who has had more than 30 years to be certain that location has remained undisturbed, has a significant advantage over investigators who are working without the fundamental piece of information they need: where to look. One of the threads that gained significant traction in the 2000s and 2010s involved a deeper examination of the criminal in 1992. Specifically, the question of who, among the individuals with relevant criminal histories, who had been in or near Springfield at that time, had the capability and the profile to have committed the Springfield 3 disappearance. This examination produced a list. Not a long list. Investigators were looking for a specific combination of characteristics that significantly narrowed the field, but a list. In the process of working through that list, of assessing each individual against the behavioral and forensic profile, was one of the most sustained and serious phases of the investigation. One name on that list, beyond Cox, that attracted sustained attention was a man with a history of crimes against women, a history of geographic mobility, and a history of meticulous behavior in the commission of those crimes. His connection to Springfield in 1992 was not as direct and documented as Cox's, but it existed. It was there in the records, in the timelines, in the places he had been and the things he had done. Investigators pursued this thread with the same careful methodology they brought to every significant lead. They traced his movements in the relevant period. They compared his behavioral history with the profile. They looked for connections, direct or indirect, to any of the 3 women, to the house on East Delmar Street, to the social world of Springfield in that summer. The connections that emerged were suggestive without being conclusive. The behavioral alignment was strong. The geographic proximity was real. The criminal history was consistent with the type of person capable of what had happened on East Delmar Street. But again, behavioral alignment is not evidence. Geographic proximity is not evidence. Criminal history is not evidence of a specific crime. The evidentiary standard required to bring charges, to take a case to a jury, to achieve the legal resolution that the families deserved, requires more than suggestion and alignment and proximity. The thread's real. The direction was real. But it led, like the others, to a place where the evidence was real but not quite enough. There is a theory about the Springfield 3 that has circulated for many years, and that deserves serious discussion here, because it is not the product of speculation or wishful thinking, but of genuine investigative analysis. It is the theory that whoever was responsible for the Springfield 3 was not choosing these women specifically, was not targeting Cheryl Levitt or Susie Streeter or Stacy McCall as individuals, but had chosen the house and had chosen the night based on opportunity and circumstance. Under this theory, the perpetrator was someone who had been watching the neighborhood, or watching the house specifically, for some period of time before that June night. Someone who had identified East Delmar as a place that, under the right conditions, could be approached with relatively low risk. Someone who had been waiting for those conditions to align, for the house to be occupied in a particular way, at a particular hour, in a particular configuration that made what he intended to do feasible. The graduation parties would have created a specific set of conditions. Late-night movement in the neighborhood. People arriving home at unusual hours. The general loosening of routine that accompanies a big event, people being out later than usual, distracted, celebrating. These conditions might have been predictable, or they might have been noticed by someone who was paying the kind of attention that most people never pay. The arrival of two young women at the house in the early hours of the morning, unexpected by almost anyone, since the original plan had been for them to stay elsewhere, was not something an external observer could have predicted, unless that observer had been watching closely enough to notice them arrive and adjust their plan accordingly. This theory has disturbing implications. It means the disappearance may have been triggered, in some sense, by the presence of Stacy and Susie at the house, their unplanned arrival creating a configuration of victims that, to someone predatory enough to be watching, was too compelling to resist. It means that Stacy McCall's decision to change her plans that night, the perfectly ordinary, completely innocent decision to go to her friend's house, instead of the friend they had originally planned to stay with, may have placed her in the path of something terrible. This is the kind of counterfactual thinking that the families of the missing live with constantly. The what-ifs. The moments where a different choice, an entirely mundane different choice, would have changed everything. The chain of ordinary decisions, this party instead of that one, this house instead of that one, this night instead of another, that led to an encounter with something extraordinary in the worst possible sense. These what-ifs are not useful in the end. They don't change what happened. They don't bring anyone back. But they are part of how people process loss of this kind, and they are woven into the fabric of the Springfield 3 story in ways that anyone who looks seriously at this case has to acknowledge. In 2011, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance, a new development in the Springfield 3 case attracted significant attention from investigators, the families, and the public. A man named Dustin Rekla, who had been connected tangentially to the case for some years, made statements that investigators found worth pursuing seriously. Rekla had a criminal history and had been in the Springfield area in the relevant period. His statements, which he made to various individuals over time, suggested a knowledge of the case that went beyond what was public and pointed in directions that investigators had been examining. The details of what Rekla said, and the specifics of how investigators responded, were subject to the discretion that active investigations require. But the development of Rekla as a person of interest in this period represented a meaningful shift in the investigation, a new direction that had emerged from years of accumulated work, a new thread that seemed, to the people pulling on it, to have real substance. Investigators pursued the Rekla connection carefully. They examined his history, his connections to Springfield, his relationships with individuals who had themselves been examined in connection with the case. They looked for the physical evidence, always the essential thing, always what the case ultimately required, that could link him to what had happened on East Delmar Street. The Rekla thread, like so many others, did not produce the definitive evidence required for prosecution, but it represented the kind of investigative development that keeps a case moving forward, a new name, a new direction, a new set of questions to ask about what happened on that June night. And it illustrated something important about the Springfield 3 investigation that is worth pausing on. The case, despite its age, despite the passage of more than 2 decades by that point, was not static. It was not frozen in 1992 and preserved in amber. It was a living investigation, one that continued to generate new leads, new persons of interest, new directions, because the people working it refused to treat it as a closed matter. Let's talk about what investigators believe, not what they can prove, but what they believe, based on decades of accumulated work, about what happened on East Delmar Street. The picture that emerges from extensive investigation and from the behavioral analysis of the scene is something like this. Someone, likely a single individual, though the possibility of more than one person is not excluded, came to the house on East Delmar Street in the early morning hours of June 7, 1992. This person came at a time when he knew, or had reason to believe, that the house would be occupied. He came prepared. He had thought about this, planned to possibly rehearse in his mind if not in practice. He gained entry to the house. The method of entry, whether through deception, through force, through a door that was already open or a door that someone opened for him, is one of the most debated questions in the case. But he got in. And once inside, he controlled the situation quickly enough and completely enough that the house showed almost no evidence of struggle. He left the house with the 3 women. This required a vehicle. It required a degree of physical capability to manage 3 people. It required the nerve and the composure to do what he was doing in a residential neighborhood in the early hours of the morning without attracting the kind of attention that would bring someone to their window or their phone. He took them somewhere that has not been found, somewhere that 30 years later continues to hold whatever remains of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. And then he resumed his life, whatever that life was, whatever normal it inhabited. He went back to it, and he has been living in it ever since, if he is still alive, carrying the knowledge of what he did and where they are, and choosing, day after day and year after year, to keep that knowledge to himself. This is the shape of what investigators believe happened. Not proven, not the basis for charges or prosecution, but the picture that emerges from the evidence and the analysis. The picture that the most serious investigators who have worked this case have arrived at after years of work. The Springfield community, through all of this, continued to carry the case. The anniversaries of the disappearance brought people together. The names of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy were kept alive in the local consciousness with a persistence that reflected the depth of the community's feeling about what had happened and what it meant. Springfield is not a city that easily accepts the idea that someone could come into its streets, into a house on a quiet residential road, and take 3 women and get away with it. That is an intolerable idea. And the community's response to its intolerability has been sustained and consistent and genuine, in a way that says something good about the city and the people who live in it. Memorial events, fundraisers, advocacy, the local media, the Springfield News, Leader, and the television stations that served the region kept the case in their coverage, returned to it on anniversaries, updated the public when there were developments. The infrastructure of community memory around the Springfield 3 was robust and real and continues to function. And the families, always the families, continued their work. Janice McCall, who had become in many ways the public face of the effort to find answers, continued to speak, continued to push, continued to refuse the silence that would have been, perhaps, an easier path. She understood that her daughter's best chance, the best chance for all 3 women, was visibility. Was the continued presence of their names in the public consciousness. Was the refusal to allow the case to become simply a file in a cabinet, a case number attached to a diminishing investigative attention. Her advocacy was not always easy. It required returning, again and again, to the most painful ground. It required describing her daughter to strangers, reliving the night she realized Stacy was gone, answering questions about a loss that never stopped being a loss because it never resolved into the finality that even the worst outcomes can sometimes provide. She did it anyway. She kept doing it. And in doing it, she kept the case alive in a way that had real consequences for the investigation, consequences that would continue to unfold, continue to matter in the years and decades ahead. There are cases that change the people who work them. Cases that get inside an investigator the way certain experiences get inside a person, not as a professional challenge to be managed and moved past, but as something permanent. Something that rewires the way you see certain things, the way you think about certain questions, the way you understand what you're doing and why it matters. The Springfield 3 was that kind of case for a significant number of the people who worked it seriously. Investigators who spent years on it, who gave nights and weekends, and the quiet hours of their own thinking to the question of what had happened on East Delmar Street, described it in terms that go beyond professional engagement. They described it as something personal, something they carried, something that didn't leave them when they left the office. Part of that is the nature of the case itself. 3 women, taken in a single night, leaving behind a scene so carefully managed that the normal tools of investigation produced almost nothing. The combination of the obvious wrongness of what had happened and the absence of the evidence that would allow justice to follow, that combination creates a particular kind of frustration that compounds over time. Each year without resolution adds to the weight of it. Each anniversary of the disappearance is a reminder that someone, somewhere knows what happened and has chosen silence. Part of it, too, is the families. Investigators who work cases like this build relationships with the families of the missing that are unlike almost any other professional relationship. They are the bearers of hope, the people the families look to for the update that never quite comes. They sit across from Janice McCall, and they see the particular way that hope and grief coexist in a person who has been living without resolution for years. They understand, at a level that goes beyond the professional, what it means to the people in front of them to find answers. This emotional dimension of the investigation is real and it matters. It doesn't compromise the work. The best investigators understand how to carry the emotional weight without letting it distort their judgment. But it is present. It is part of what drives the work forward through the long periods when nothing is happening and nothing seems like it ever will. The geography of the Springfield 3 case, the specific terrain of southwestern Missouri, in which the investigation has unfolded, is worth thinking about carefully, because geography shapes what is possible in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Springfield sits in the Ozark Highlands, a region heavily folded terrain, deep river valleys, dense forest cover, and a rural landscape that becomes, very quickly outside the city limits, genuinely remote. The roads network is extensive, but the land between the roads is often steep and wooded and, in places, genuinely inaccessible. This is landscape that could conceal almost anything indefinitely, not because it is mysterious or supernatural, but simply because it is large and rugged, and the resources required to search it comprehensively are beyond what any single investigation can marshal. Within a reasonable driving distance of East Delmar Street, an hour, 2 hours at most, the kind of distance that could be covered in the early morning hours without attracting attention. There are areas of the Ozarks where the terrain has probably looked essentially the same for the past 30 years, where whatever was placed there in June of 1992 could still be there, undisturbed, unreached by the searches that have been conducted over the years. Investigators have thought carefully about this. They have modeled the probable behavior of the perpetrator, the likely route taken from East Delmar Street, the likely distance traveled, the likely characteristics of the site selected, and use those models to prioritize search locations. This kind of behavioral geography is a sophisticated tool, and the investigators who have applied it to the Springfield 3 have been serious and methodical about it. But the models can only narrow the field. They cannot pinpoint a location. And without more specific information, without someone who knows coming forward, without a technological breakthrough that allows a different kind of search to be conducted, the geographic reality of the Ozarks remains the Springfield 3's most stubborn physical obstacle. The land holds its secrets. It has held them for more than 30 years, and whoever put those secrets there knew what he was doing when he chose the place. By the mid-2000s, the Springfield 3 case had become a touchstone in discussions of cold case investigation methodology, not just in Missouri, but in the broader national conversation about how law enforcement agencies handle cases that age without resolution. The case had illustrated, in particularly clear terms, several of the challenges that cold case work presents: the degradation of physical evidence over time, the difficulty of maintaining investigative momentum when there are no new developments to generate urgency, the challenge of preserving witness memories and institutional knowledge as investigators retire and new personnel take over cases they didn't originally work, the problem of tips, the sheer volume of them in a high-profile case, and the resources required to process them adequately. But it had also illustrated the opposite side of those challenges, the ways in which the passage of time can be, counterintuitively, an asset in certain kinds of investigation. Witnesses who weren't ready to talk in 1992 sometimes became ready to talk 10 or 15 or 20 years later. Relationships that akin someone's willingness to share information, loyalty to a friend, fear of a partner, uncertainty about what they had seen, sometimes loosened over time. People who had been protecting someone sometimes stopped protecting them. People who had been afraid sometimes became less afraid. And people who had been carrying something heavy sometimes reached a point where they needed to put it down. Several significant developments in the Springfield 3 case, not all of them public, not all of them resulting in the kind of dramatic breakthrough that makes headlines, came through exactly this dynamic. Through witnesses who had waited years before deciding that what they knew was something they needed to share. Through individuals who had been on the periphery of the case in 1992 coming back into contact with investigators years later, carrying information that had been sitting in their memories, unshared, through the intervening decades. This is why cold case investigators emphasize, with particular urgency, the importance of continued public engagement with unsolved cases. The person who has relevant information doesn't always know they have it. Or they know they have it but don't understand its significance. Or they understand its significance but have reasons that feel compelling to them, even if they wouldn't survive scrutiny, not to share it. Continued visibility of a case creates continued opportunities for those people to reconsider, to decide that the information they're holding belongs with investigators rather than in their own heads. The role of the broader true crime community in the Springfield 3 case is something worth examining honestly, because it is genuinely complicated. The case attracted, over the years, an enormous amount of attention from people who follow true crime, people who were not connected professionally to the investigation, but who engaged with the case seriously, who researched it carefully, who developed analyses and theories, and who, in some cases, brought genuinely useful skills and perspectives to bear on questions that official investigators were also asking. Some of these individuals made real contributions. People with research skills, with access to public records, with knowledge of the specific social and criminal landscape of Springfield in 1992 from personal experience, contributed information and analysis that enriched the investigative picture. The crowdsourced nature of online true crime communities, at its best, produces a kind of distributed investigation that can surface things that official resources might miss. But the community also created problems. Accusations circulated against individuals who had not been seriously considered by investigators, accusations based on partial information, on circumstantial reasoning that didn't hold up under scrutiny, on the human tendency to see patterns that confirm a preferred explanation. People who had nothing to do with the Springfield 3 found themselves discussed and identified in online forums as potential perpetrators, and the consequences of this for those individuals, who were, in some cases, simply people who had lived in Springfield in 1992 and had some marginal connection to the social world of the case, were real and harmful. This is the shadow side of the true crime community's engagement with unsolved cases, and it is something that the Springfield 3 illustrates with particular clarity. The desire to find answers is genuine and understandable. The frustration of a case that has gone unsolved for so long is real. But the application of that desire and that frustration to specific individuals, without the discipline and the evidentiary standards that official investigation requires, can cause serious harm to innocent people. Investigators dealing with the Springfield 3 had to navigate this dynamic carefully, maintaining the public engagement with the case that was genuinely useful while trying to prevent or limit the harm that came from the less disciplined aspects of that engagement. There is a specific detail about the night of June 6th into June 7th, 1992 that has not always received the attention it deserves. It is a detail that, when you sit with it, opens a particular kind of question about how the events of that night unfolded. The graduation parties that Stacy and Sue attended that evening were not small, private gatherings. They were large social events, attended by many of their classmates and their classmates' families. The kind of events where the attendees are visible, where people see who is there. Observe how people are interacting. Notice who leaves with whom and when. If someone had been watching Stacy and Susie that evening, following their movements through the graduation events, tracking where they went and who they were with, they would have been doing so in a relatively crowded social environment. The risk of being noticed would have been real. and yet the disappearance has the characteristics of something that was, if not precisely planned in advance, at least responsive to circumstances as they developed, a quality of situational adaptation that suggests awareness and presence throughout the evening. This possibility, that someone had been observing Stacy and Susie through the course of the graduation events, had followed them as they made their way eventually to East Delmar Street, and had acted on an opportunity as it presented itself, is one that investigators have considered. It has implications for the type of perpetrator responsible. It suggests someone comfortable in social environments, capable of moving through a crowded graduation party without drawing unwanted attention. Someone who blended. Someone unremarkable on the surface. The alternative, that the house on East Delmar Street was the target from the beginning, that Cheryl was the intended focus and the presence of Stacy and Susie was either anticipated or adapted to, is equally worth considering. Under this version of events, the perpetrator's attention was fixed on Cheryl, on the house, on the opportunity that East Delmar Street represented. And the arrival of 2 additional people in the early hours of the morning was something he incorporated into his plans, rather than something that changed them fundamentally. Both possibilities have been considered seriously. Both have implications for the identity of the perpetrator and for the specific circumstances of that night, and neither can be definitively excluded based on the available evidence. In 2010, the Springfield Police Department made a series of statements about the Springfield 3 case that attracted significant attention. The department acknowledged, more directly than it sometimes had in the past, that the case remained active and that investigators were pursuing specific leads. Without naming persons of interest publicly, the department communicated that the investigation had not reached a dead end, that there were specific directions being pursued, specific individuals whose connections to the case were being examined. This was not a dramatic announcement. It was not the kind of statement that produces headlines about imminent arrests or resolved mysteries. But for the families, and for the people in Springfield who had been following the case for nearly 2 decades, it was meaningful. It was confirmation that the case was still alive in the way it needed to be alive, not just as a memory, not just as a community wound that had never healed, but as an active, ongoing investigation with real investigative momentum. Janice McCall responded to these statements with the particular kind of measured hope that she had learned to maintain over the years. Hope that was real but calibrated, that didn't allow itself to become certainty, because certainty had been disappointed too many times. She said that she believed answers were possible, that she believed someone knew what had happened, and that at some point, for some reason, that person or those people would choose to share what they knew. That she had not given up and would not give up. This position, the sustained, calibrated, resilient hope of a mother who has been waiting for answers for nearly 20 years, is one of the most remarkable human things in this story. It is not naive. It is not the hope of someone who doesn't understand the odds or the reality of what has happened. It is the hope of someone who has looked directly at the worst possibilities and decided, deliberately and with full awareness of what she is deciding, to keep going anyway. The question of evidence, specifically the question of whether enough evidence exists to bring charges against anyone connected to the Springfield 3, is one that has been present in the case from the beginning and has grown more complicated, not less over the decades. In American criminal law, the standard for charging someone with a crime and bringing them to trial is probable cause. The standard for conviction is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. These are high bars, deliberately. They exist because the consequences of wrongful accusation and wrongful conviction are severe, and because the justice system is designed, at its foundation, to protect the accused from the power of the state. In a case without bodies, without a confirmed cause of death, without the physical evidence that typically forms the backbone of a homicide prosecution, meeting those standards is extraordinarily difficult, not impossible. There have been successful prosecutions in cases without bodies, cases in which circumstantial evidence and witness testimony have been sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury, but difficult. And in the Springfield 3, where the physical evidence from the scene was limited to begin with and has been further compromised by the passage of time. The evidentiary challenge is genuinely severe. Investigators and prosecutors who have looked at the case over the years have had to engage with this reality honestly. The belief that someone is responsible for what happened, the strong evidence, informed belief that certain individuals either committed or know about this crime, is not the same as having what you need to take that belief into a courtroom. The gap between what investigators believe and what they can prove is the gap that has prevented resolution in this case. That gap might never close. This is the painful possibility that everyone connected to the Springfield Three has had to consider. The possibility that the truth, even if it is known to someone, will never be established in the legal sense, will never result in the accountability that justice requires. That the three women will remain missing, the perpetrator will remain unidentified publicly, and the case will end only when everyone with direct knowledge of it is gone. This is not a comfortable possibility. It is not one that anyone connected to the case accepts willingly. But it is real, and ignoring it would be dishonest. Through the 2010s, as the case approached and then passed its 20th and then its 25th anniversary, the investigative community working the Springfield Three continued to develop and refine its understanding of what had happened. New DNA technology made it possible to extract and analyze genetic material from samples that would previously have too degraded or too small to yield usable information. The application of these techniques to evidence collected from the house on East Delmar Street produced results that investigators found significant, results that they were careful not to discuss publicly in ways that might compromise their investigative value, but which were real and which moved certain aspects of the case forward. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had produced dramatic results in cold cases across the country, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer, was being applied to cold case evidence with increasing frequency and increasing success. The Springfield Three was a case where investigators and analysts associated with the effort had considered whether genetic genealogy might provide a breakthrough. The specific details of whether and how this technique has been applied to the Springfield Three are not fully public, but the potential is real and has been discussed by investigators connected to the case. If the unknown biological material from the house on East Delmar Street can be connected to a specific individual through genetic genealogy, if the DNA can be traced to a family tree that leads to a name, and that name connects to someone who was in Springfield in June 1992 with the history and the profile consistent with the crime, then the case has a real path to resolution. Not a guaranteed path, not a simple one, but a real one. This possibility has given the people working the Springfield Three genuine reason to believe that the decades of work are not, ultimately, in vain. That the case is not simply a tragedy without an ending. That the ending, the real ending, with names and accountability, and the knowledge that the three women have been found, might still be possible. Let's talk about what 30 years of distance does to a case like this. Not to the investigation, not to the evidence, but to the people. The human dimension of what it means to carry something like the Springfield Three for 3 decades. Janice McCall grew older while waiting for answers. The parents of missing children always do. They age while the image they hold in their minds of their child remains fixed at the moment of disappearance. Stacy McCall, in Janice's mind, and in the minds of everyone who loved her, remained 18. Remained the girl who had just graduated, who was standing at the edge of everything. Remained exactly who she was on the night of June 6, 1992, even as the world moved forward around that fixed point. This is one of the cruelest dimensions of the disappearance of a young person. Not just the loss itself, but the freezing of the loss in a particular moment. The inability of grief to complete itself, to move through its necessary stages, because there is no finality, no grave to visit, no date of death to acknowledge. Just an open question held in place by the absence of an answer, keeping the person fixed forever at the age they were when they disappeared. The friends and classmates of Stacy McCall and Susie Streeter, the people who graduated with them that June night, who were at the same parties, who said goodbye and went home and woke up the next morning to discover that two of their classmates were gone. Those people have built their adult lives in the shadow of what happened. They have married, had children, built careers. They have done the things that adults do, and many of them have carried the weight of that night their entire adult lives. The memory of the last time they saw Stacy, the last time they saw Susie, the knowledge that something terrible happened to two of their friends, and that nobody knows what. Some of them have spoken publicly over the years. Some of them have participated in the ongoing effort to keep the case visible. Some of them have stayed in Springfield and have the particular relationship to the case that comes from living in the community where it happened. A constant, low-grade awareness that the story of the Springfield Three is also, in some way, their story. The story of their generation, their city, their night. The 25th anniversary of the Springfield Three disappearance in 2017 brought a significant renewal of public attention to the case. Several major media outlets produced respective pieces. True crime podcasts and YouTube channels covered the case in depth. The Springfield community gathered, as it had on so many previous anniversaries, to remember the three women and to renew the commitment to finding answers. And around this same period, new investigative energy was being applied to the case in ways that gave those closest to it genuine reason to believe that the anniversary might be followed, in the not-too-distant future, by the resolution that had been so long in coming. Several developments were occurring simultaneously. The genetic evidence from the house was being re-examined with new technology. Investigators in Springfield were in communication with investigators in other jurisdictions who had developed information relevant to potential suspects. The behavioral analysis of the case had been refined and updated with the benefit of decades of additional research into the specific type of crime that the Springfield Three appeared to represent. And certain individuals who had previously declined to cooperate with investigators were, in this period, being reapproached in ways that, in some cases, produced new information. None of this was publicly announced in dramatic terms. None of it produced the kind of definitive breakthrough that would have generated headlines declaring the case solved. But the people closest to the investigation, the investigators who had worked it longest, the family members who maintained the most consistent contact with the department, were describing a sense of forward movement that felt different from the intermittent hope and disappointment that had characterized so much of the preceding 25 years. Something was happening. Something was building, yet the destination wasn't certain. But the direction felt real. There is a concept in investigative work called the point of irreversibility. The moment in an investigation when enough has accumulated that the case can no longer go cold in the traditional sense. When the evidence, the witnesses, the analysis, the accumulated work of years has reached a critical mass that means forward momentum is self-sustaining. When the case has become, in some fundamental way, too far along to stop. Whether the Springfield Three investigation has reached that point is something that investigators working the case would be better positioned to assess than anyone on the outside. But the picture that emerges from looking at the case in its totality, the decades of work, the accumulation of evidence and analysis, the specific developments of recent years, suggests that the investigation is in a fundamentally different place than it was in the early 1990s. Not just older, different. More advanced, more focused, more grounded in specific, actionable directions rather than the broad, uncertain searching of the early years. The people who have been working this case for the longest time believe it can be resolved. Not all of them are optimistic about the timeline. The history of the case has taught caution about timelines, but they believe the truth is knowable, that the person or persons responsible can be identified, that the three women can be found. This belief is not just hope. It is grounded in the specific, real work that has been done and that continues to be done, in the evidence that exists and the technology now available to analyze it, in the witnesses who are carrying information that they haven't yet shared, but that may, for reasons they will ultimately determine on their own timetable, be shared, in the fundamental principle of cold case investigation that says the truth does not disappear. Evidence does not disappear. People's memories do not disappear. The case can age, but it cannot die, because what happened happened. It is fixed in time, and fixed things can be found. As we approach the end of our journey through this case, as we move toward the final questions, the final analysis, the final reckoning with what is known and what is not, it is worth pausing on one more aspect of the Springfield 3 that deserves to be held carefully before we let it go. It is the question of who these three women were, not as victims, not as the central figures in a mystery, but as people, as the specific, irreplaceable individuals whose lives were interrupted on a June night in Missouri, who had people who loved them and futures that were waiting for them, and ordinary days ahead of them that they deserved to live. Cheryl Levitt was 35 years old. She had built a life. She had a daughter she loved and a business she was proud of and friends who valued her company and clients who trusted her with the intimate work of making them feel better about themselves. She had survived difficulty and found her footing. She had reasons to be glad about her life, and she was, by all accounts, glad about it. She was the kind of person who made things better, who made places warmer and conversations easier and mornings brighter. The world she inhabited was better for her presence in it. Susie Streeter was 18 years old. She had just finished high school and was standing at the beginning of everything. She had her mother's warmth and her own bright intelligence and a social ease that made her the kind of person other people liked being around. She had plans, the way 18-year-olds have plans. Not fully formed, not yet, but present and real and full of the particular energy of a life not yet settled into its definitive shape. She had decades ahead of her. She had so much ahead of her. Stacy McCall was 18 years old. She was quiet and thoughtful and careful with people's feelings. She listened. She paid attention. She was the kind of friend who made you feel seen, who remembered what you told her, who showed up. She had a mother who loved her with the specific, total love that only parents have access to. She had friends who counted on her. She had a future that was just beginning to take shape, college, whatever came after college, the long unfolding of an adult life that was going to be full of the things that thoughtful, caring, careful people fill their lives with. These three women deserve to be found. They deserve to be found. Their families deserve the answers that have been kept from them for more than 30 years. The community that has held their names and kept their memory alive deserves resolution. And the truth, which exists, which is real, which is held somewhere in the mind of someone who made a choice in the early hours of June 7, 1992, deserves finally to be told. The years continue to pass. The case continued to breathe. By the time the Springfield 3 crossed its 30th anniversary in 2022, something had shifted in the public conversation around it. Not the facts remained what they had always been, stubbornly unchanged, rooted in that one night in June 1992. But the tone had shifted, the discussion had moved, gradually and then more decisively, from the language of mystery toward the language of solvability. From asking what happened to asking when someone would finally be held accountable for it. This shift reflected something real. The investigative landscape around the Springfield 3 had changed in ways that mattered. Genetic genealogy had transformed cold case investigation across the country, producing identifications in cases that had seemed permanently closed. The specific techniques being applied to biological evidence from the house on East Delmar Street were more powerful than anything available in 1992 or 2012. The gap between what investigators believed and what they could prove, while still real, had narrowed. Robert Craig Cox remained in a Florida present aging. His statements about the case part of the permanent record. Other persons of interest remained under various degrees of scrutiny. The investigation, never fully dormant, continued in the ways that serious cold case investigations continue, methodically, patiently, without the urgency of the early days but with a depth and a focus that the early days couldn't have had. Janice McCall continued to speak, continued to say her daughter's name, continued to insist, in the face of everything, that the silence was not permanent. That someone knew. That the truth was still out there, still intact, still waiting to be brought into the light where it belonged. She was right to insist. The truth does not disappear. What happened on East Delmar Street happened, and it left traces in evidence, in memory, in the knowledge carried by whoever was responsible. Those traces exist, they persist. They are the foundation on which resolution, when it comes, will be built. 3 women. One night. One question that has not yet been answered. But the question is still being asked, and somewhere, the answer exists. And so we arrive at the place where all stories like this arrive, not at an ending, because there is no ending yet, but at the edge of what is known. The place where the facts stop and the silence begins. Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall have been missing for more than 30 years. 3 women who walked into a house on a warm June night and never walked out. 3 lives interrupted at different stages, 1 fully built, 2 just beginning, by someone who chose to take them and has chosen every day since to say nothing. That choice, the daily ongoing choice of silence, is itself a kind of crime. Not in the legal sense, perhaps, but in the human sense. In the sense that matters most to the people who love these women, and who have spent 3 decades living inside the question of what happened to them. The investigation continues. The families continue. Springfield continues to hold these 3 names close, to refuse the forgetting that would be easier but would also be a betrayal. The investigators who have given years of their professional lives to this case continue to believe that resolution is possible, that the evidence exists, that the truth, however carefully buried, can still be found. If you know something, anything, about what happened on East Delmar Street on the night of June 6 into June 7, 1992, the Springfield Police Department wants to hear from you. The tip line is open. It has always been open. And the information you are carrying, whatever it is, however small it seems, may be exactly the piece that changes everything. Cheryl deserved more time. Susie deserved her whole life. Stacy deserved everything that was waiting for her. They still deserve the truth. We all do. Thank you for listening tonight. If this case stayed with you, if these 3 women stayed with you, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Good night, and stay safe.